Many of you have been through this whole 2-week slog, and I know how exhausting even a day or two can be. And so I'm very grateful for your attendance here at the very end. And this is the final side event slot for the whole COP. So having said that, thank you for coming. I hope that you're going to be excited and find this a rewarding hour and a half, because we're going to be talking about what the future might look like for climate governance. I'm Karl Schultz. I'm the founder and executive chairman of the Higher Ground Foundation. I've been working on adaptation metrics for the past 8-9 years. I've been working on climate change my entire career. Here are a number of different issues that we're going to cover, and the experts who are going to be covering this are doing it for reasons that I think are really important, and that's because we're launching our vulnerability reduction credit standard today, and we're starting the pilot implementation and partnerships phase of the Higher Ground Foundation. And VRCs, we are working to make a standardized measure of climate adaptation outputs as a single fungible unit. It's transferable and priceable. And we are next gen, but we also understand the importance of integrating a whole variety of new developments in platforms, in technologies, and in processes. And so that's why we have this fantastic panelist, group of panelists here, including Tom Bauman, who's been involved in standards forever. He was the founder of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. He's the chair of the ISO climate group, and he is going to be speaking about smart standards, the new term, trademark, and also blockchain applications for climate. We then have Joe Madden, who is our blockchain guru, who will be talking about, broadly speaking, all of his work looking at commodities and blockchain and how these can be applied innovatively to climate governance. Then we have Lauren Carter, who's with Bea Capital, and she is an enthusiast and a knowledgeable person when it comes to blockchain applications for finance. And she does finance. And so that's exactly what we want to have said by a person who can say it in finance. Then we have Chiara Ambrosino, and she's with the IDE, which is a development NGO, and she is the head of their climate group. We've been working together and looking at project opportunities using VRC. So she's going to talk about a project in the ground that we're working on right now, applying VRCs that achieves a lot of different developmental and climate ends. And then last but certainly not least, we have Douglas Kripe, and he's with the Group on Earth Observations out of Geneva. He's a climate scientist who is working right now to aggregate millions and millions of data sets and create a platform that makes it usable for all. And we're working right now to see how we can work with Geo to basically develop VRCs, make it easy for VRC users to use his platform or series of platforms. So here's the agenda. I don't think I need to say anything more. We're going to divide it up into 2 broad themes. We're going to hopefully have time for Q&A. As I mentioned, the Secretariat has been kind enough to give us a little extra time since we're starting late. So let's begin. Tom?
Thank you very much, Karl, for the introductions, and very nice to see everyone here. I know it's been a long COP. And it's the end of the day. I have 10 minutes, so I'll jump right into a quick overview of blockchain and digital innovations leading towards governance innovation for climate and for smart standards to support the uptake of blockchain and related technologies to help us with mitigation, adaptation, and climate finance. So blockchain, you've probably heard of Bitcoin. Relatively, it's probably 10 years for Bitcoin, but blockchain's starting to enter into the mainstream economy more and more. But it's often paired or combined with a number of other digital technologies like Internet of Things, so connected smart devices, big data analytics, and many others. Roughly speaking, blockchain opportunities for climate can cross a number of different applications. So for climate actions, mitigation, MRV of carbon reductions, but also for adaptation and also for tracking climate finance and incenting climate finance. Carbon currency on a digital currency for carbon trading, whether that's credits and permits for use in registries, as well as in existing markets such as commodity markets, capital markets, and so on. We're able to piggyback on top of products and their transactions using blockchain and accompany that with their attributes. The next speaker, Joe Madden, will go into that in more detail. These are just a few examples of blockchain applications across climate and sustainability. One of my roles is with the Blockchain Research Institute, and I'm researching climate and sustainability applications, broadly speaking. And so you can see there's an array that top two, Xpansiv and Provenance, are examples of supply chains using blockchain. But then there's some initiatives like the Climate Ledger, which had a hack for climate event over 4 days here at this COP, Climate Chain, and a whole number of different blockchain applications using different blockchain technologies. So the point there is blockchain is not monolithic. There's a great diversity of blockchain applications, and those blockchains are using other digital technologies, as I said, Internet of Things, but they might also incorporate smart contracts, which is a way to automate MRV, legal processes, and other processes that we use in the climate space, so automating that within the blockchain. General benefits to improve MRV and markets, generally speaking. Blockchain brings efficiency and accountability, so it helps to drive down some of the costs that are involved, again, through automation of MRV with smart contracts, for example, but also improving the integrity of the accounting so that there's greater transparency in this shared ledger, as well as avoiding the double counting, which has been an issue, for example, with carbon credits, as well as the ability to more cost effectively scale blockchain applications from, say, climate towards other SDGs, broadly speaking. And of course, that's very critical for adaptation, as it's more involved with sustainability than purely climate. And so I just highlighted quickly some of the examples of the different blockchain applications. People are applying blockchain to natural capital. You know, forests, for example, you could put the carbon budget on blockchain and represent that with tokens. Supply chains for commodity markets. Smart cities are using blockchain as well. And then a number of other types of applications. One blockchain can feed into the next blockchain, so you can have blockchain applied to low carbon supply chains, feeding into companies, feeding into cities, and there needs to be some level of interoperability of those blockchain systems if the accounting is going to maintain its integrity, rolling it up into an NDC registry, for example. So in terms of governance, looking at standards, and there's many, many standards in the climate space, but generally speaking, standards provide us great value to the global economy, representing about 2 or 3%. So it is a big deal in terms of our quality of life and standard of living. Billions of dollars are spent on developing standards and related tools, whether that's protocols or guidance, soft law, and so on. So big opportunity to improve our standard system and achieve even greater benefits from the use of standards, particularly in sustainability and climate, where if we didn't have the standards around, for example, carbon dioxide is invisible and odorless and exists on paper, but soon is going to exist on a blockchain. So the climate governance complexity, I think many of you already realize the complexity that's involved, and that's been amplified now with a bottom-up approach of climate actions from a variety of different actors being encouraged, each approaching climate accounting or adaptation from different points. So creating an MRV architecture that can encompass all of those different bottom-up approaches so that they're compatible and can be consolidated in a holistic, say, carbon budget perspective from a mitigation angle is essential. And so that challenge, regardless of blockchain, has to be addressed. But blockchain helps to address that challenge. Again, the interaction with SDGs further increases the complexity for that governance. Within the MRV space, there's over 1,000 standards and methodologies and so on. I know adaptation isn't quite there yet. That's probably an underestimate, I've been told. There's probably 10,000 or more. And many of them are conflicting or duplicative, and they don't work together. So again, we have to fix that climate governance challenge that we have. And those standards came from a top-down, largely, perspective, uncoordinated as well. And and it's been costly and taking a long time. Blockchain applications are entering the marketplace at such a rapid rate that if we can't build the rules that help those blockchain systems have the integrity they need, because a blockchain system is very good at tracking the information that's put into it, but if you put in bad information, it's tracking bad information, and the rules ensure that the information going in represents a genuine environmental issue or benefit coming out. And so it's essential that we get these blockchain systems done right, and so having a new governance model or collaboration model that supports how those rules are developed at the same rate that blockchain and other technologies go to market, rather than taking 3 or 4 years to develop a standard, has to happen in a much more agile, rapid manner. So happy to share that during this COP, I'm from Canada, by the way, the Canadian government is funding 3 blockchain projects in the Pacific Alliance countries, which are in Latin America. Thank you. And one of those projects is about next generation governance innovation for the application of blockchain for MRV. In this case, the mitigation space, which is a priority for those countries in Canada. So we're working with IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association. I'm with ClimateCHECK. And we're implementing this over the next 4 years. We have some funding to go about capacity building, engaging stakeholders to design this next-gen governance platform, which would then be applied to create smarter standards, meaning the application of IT to standards, just like the application of IT to buildings gives you smart buildings, or IT to agriculture gives you smart agriculture. So I'm going very quickly here because I'm doing a 30-minute presentation in 10. The activities are involving the piloting of these smart standards within a couple of projects, and we're hoping that we can also involve adaptation projects as well. Hey, Alexi. And then over the 4 years, pull that all together as a basis for furthering this governance innovation in support of the technology and digital innovation in support of climate actions. How are we doing that? We're basically using global solution networks, online tools, democratized governance models in order to mass produce these MRV standards within a consolidated MRV architecture. I think I'm out of time, so unfortunately I'll have to stop there to respect the time limits for the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. That, I think, gives us a great introduction to a couple of the critical and, I think, game-changing approaches and technologies that we have. Next, Joe will be speaking in depth on blockchain applications from his perspectives as one who's implemented a lot in the world.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Madden. I'm a co-founder and CEO at Xpansiv Data Systems. We're located in San Francisco and Albuquerque. And I think one of the things, just before we even get started, I think the concept of blockchain, or the word blockchain, is something that I'm hoping we don't even talk about in the very near future. We don't talk so much about the internet, right? We just say that I'm going to get an Uber or something like that. Like, it enables things. It's not a thing, it just enables things. So blockchain has all kinds of applications as a technology, but really it's about how it's applied, not the actual technology itself. I think that's like a fundamental leap that we have to make in order to get where we need to go. So I'm actually not going to talk too much about blockchain, but more about some of the things it enables. So let's see here. So I don't know how many folks are familiar with the statement that data is the new oil. The idea that if we look in 10 or 15 years ago, almost all the major companies or the most valuable companies in the world were oil companies. Now they're almost all effectively data companies. So if you look at the top 10 capitalized companies in the world, probably 8 of them are tech companies, and they're really data companies. So when we think about that, what they're really doing when we talk about data is the new oil actually, to be of any value, and it's kind of crazy to talk about oil at a climate conference, but really it needs to be refined into something else, right? So now we have loads and loads and loads and loads of data, and the key is refining it into something that's useful. So when we talk about things like blockchain, it's only as good as the data that enables it. And so what Tom's talking about with smart standards is a way to take data and refine that into something of meaning, right? And so what we're talking about here is we're talking about commodities, and we're looking at commodities for a number of reasons. I think 2 years ago in Paris, we presented a concept paper with the idea that blockchain would enable the differentiation of commodities. That was our thesis, was that resource constraints would lead to the differentiation of commodities and markets. And the reason why we're looking at commodities was really because of their impact. And so everything trades undifferentiated today, and you have multiple parallel markets in and around commodities. So you have carbon relates to other commodities. You have biofuels that trade separately. You have all these things that trade separately. And the idea is really to converge that over time so that you can start to have more effective markets. And so the other thing is that they're antiquated. They're incredibly antiquated. So there's basically no information available from the point of supply all the way up to the market in commodities. There's no legacy infrastructure. There's not a lot of information about what's happening at the edge of the supply chain. So when you hear about massive methane emissions and things like that, there's not a lot of information that's available in a market context. And so what we do is we mine commodity production data. So in this case, we actually take data from a wellhead or a palm plantation or anything, any point of production. We're going in and we're mining data, and we structure that data into basically a base unit, which is the underlying asset, whether it's a barrel of oil or MCF of gas or a ton of palm oil or a ton of biofuels. Any of those things are basically a core asset. And then what we do is we apply smart standards, and we start to make sense of that data in relation to that asset. So you can think about methane leakage, you can think about deforestation, you can think about all these things that you can't see today associated with the underlying asset. And so once we identify those variables, we actually create effectively a tokenized unit, and we can attach that information to the underlying asset. So now you have a digitized record of that underlying asset, and you can, to the extent that you have smart standards and you have ways to contextualize that information, you can then attach that information to that digital asset. And that has all kinds of implications in the commodities market, far beyond just impact, but it's sort of a transformational approach. And so when we think about this over time, we don't think of this as and we call this digital feedstock, but we don't think of this as coming in and disrupting the massive markets and things like that. We actually think of this as a transformation over time. It's a base unit to start the transformation of more efficient markets, not only from a technology perspective, but markets that actually include impact information and transact that information seamlessly. So you're talking about really the convergence of markets over time. So oil markets that count the carbon intensity of a barrel of oil at the point of transaction. So that's already baked in. So all of a sudden you can have the inclusion of externalities in the base unit that's actually traded. So you're really seeing basically a convergence of environmental commodities and commodities broadly. And so that's what we see over time. I think for us, I think here, I put this here just because when we look at this, as I put Xpansiv in the middle here, no one on that is actually sponsoring us or anything like that, but I want to really hone in that this isn't really just a technology problem, it's a stakeholder problem, and making sure that everybody understands the possibilities of things. So we actually spent 2 years running around the world just engaging, talking to folks, making sure they understand what we're doing. And so, like I said, no one up here is sponsoring us or anything like that, but it's the relationships that over time matter, whether it's Xpansiv or anybody else. It's really creating an ecosystem to be able to enable transformation. And so building a community in and around technology, not just technology. And I think that's one of the key points that when we look at this, how we're thinking about this is you have to have key players in an ecosystem, and you have to have the leadership in that ecosystem aware of what exactly is taking place and what's possible. So we spent a lot of time in and around that. So that's it.
Thank you, Joe. I think you've conveyed not just the potential, but the reality of blockchain moving and providing us with space to really work going forward.
Yeah, I don't know if this is all, but I think it's worth saying that. So what we did prove out, and I didn't mention this, is so we proved the concept. We actually presented this in Barcelona in May, but we proved out the scalability of this, where we're basically taking in about 1% of U.S. natural gas production and digitizing that, and now we can start to add information to that. But we really just see commodities as, whether it's natural gas or biofuels or any of those things, the data from a technology perspective is the same. And this approach is incredibly scalable, so you can start to move at the scale of commodities broadly.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Joe. And now, Lauren, if you could speak to something that I think is very important, finance, money. And as you probably know, being at the COP, finance always comes up at the high level. Do we have solutions? How do these new technologies, new approaches, and new standards address it, solve for it, and create new issues? So Lauren, please.
How do I click next? Is that this thing? Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Lauren Carter. I work in climate finance, mostly in Morocco. I work with an intersection of governments, DFIs, private investors to create and fund climate smart projects. And so while I'm in no way, shape, or form an expert on the digital solutions available for climate finance, I am a little bit ahead of my colleagues in the fact that I recognize that they exist, and I recognize that we need to integrate them. A lot of people here, even when they seem very plugged into a lot of new trends coming on in this space, have no idea what any of these technologies are. And so even if we're still figuring out how to integrate them into the work that we do, I think the first step is for people to even understand that they exist and the transformative possibilities to bring them into the climate space. So, yes? Okay, cool. So starting off with cryptocurrencies, and these are sort of, I'm not going to explain how any of these work. I'm sure that all of you know that, and I'm the wrong person to explain it, even if I was. But these are the different things that we think are really interesting and how they're going to be integrated into finance. So the first part of cryptocurrencies is just the transparency and the governance. Does anyone remember when the American Red Cross lost $500 million for Haiti aid relief? Anyone? You got, okay. Yeah, that would make it hard to do. And I think that that's one of the big things that I see being interesting with cryptocurrencies. A lot of governments that we work with, people are suspicious of the political risk of investing in them. They wonder about corruption, et cetera. Blockchain makes it harder for people to steal money. And I hesitate to, fall into the, Titanic, it's unsinkable, it's unhackable thing, but I think that we can all understand that blockchain and the ledger makes it much more difficult to manipulate, and through that, it increases donor confidence, both at an investor level, at a philanthropic level, at a government level. And I think that it's important and will increase, whether it's crowd equity, philanthropic donations, programs being done by the Green Climate Fund, et cetera, to actually know that the money that they're giving is going where you thought it was. So that's one major advantage of cryptocurrencies and the blockchain. Other ones are new financial systems. We're seeing now SolarCoin, Venn, there's a whole laundry list of them, but actual new financial systems that actually incorporate more sustainable metrics. So how do we actually create decentralized currencies that support innovation, that are carbon-backed, that encourage solar development, et cetera? So we're actually creating new financial structures and architecture. And then also we have smart contracts. I was recently in Lisbon at the Web Summit, and I met like the guy who, he was one of the people who was actually kind of cracking the smart contracts are, so they're digital ledgers that essentially allow you to enforce contract terms. So instead of like you and me signing a contract and both of us kind of agreeing that we both upheld our end of the bargain, there are certain kind of indicators in it that once you hit those, you unlock it, and that releases funding. And this guy was actually working to, there are certain loopholes in these smart contracts, and he was actually working to come up with the data architecture to make sure that people weren't getting money when they weren't supposed to. So they're still not perfect. But things like Ethereum, the other main cryptocurrency right now, have smart contract components that ensure that the relationships that we're entering into are upheld, which again is a critical component in finance. So beyond the cryptocurrencies, applications for blockchain that we're looking at, land rights. Outside of America, land is really hard to prove ownership, and that makes developers scared to invest money in land projects that someone could show up later and say, hey, actually, that's not yours, that's mine. So by integrating land rights on the blockchain, it increases investor confidence that when they build a project, that it's their project, it's their land, whether they're leasing it or they're buying it, they don't have to worry that they invest all this money and find out that it is stuck in a legal battle. Administrative overhead. Auditing a lot of this stuff is expensive, and even when I go through and I develop monitoring and evaluation policies based on the IFC's like performance standards, the actual like time and energy that it will take a team of people to go through and make sure that all of these standards are enforced is one of the main blockages for especially small companies to enforce SDGs, human rights, all this other stuff, just because of the time. Blockchain enables like Tom and John have been talking about, it's an immediate, transparent way of sometimes tracking certain indicators that can be used to reduce actual people coming out and auditing these things. And also avoidance of double counting. The carbon market collapsed for a variety of reasons, but one of the big issues with it was that people just couldn't really verify whether or not the carbon credits were 1 carbon credit, 2 carbon credits, 3 carbon credits, and blockchain would enable the carbon markets to be a little bit more transparent. Next up, AI. AI is going to be really interesting for portfolio screening and recommendations. We're working with some interesting people who have identified, like if you want to divest or invest in certain things, you can pick, I want to screen companies for their human rights abuses. I want to screen companies for, how well they're managing their carbon, their energy efficiency, et cetera. And they will build you a portfolio based on this. And you can also simultaneously divest in companies that are not doing these things. And then in a Netflix-y type way, they will start recommending new stocks and investments to you. And so you kind of get your portfolio, like once it starts to get to know you and how you invest and what you're interested in, it'll start to push forward with more ideas. And that's a company called One Pebble, if anyone's interested. And then stakeholder connectivity. We're seeing just a lot of ways that artificial intelligence can bridge the gaps between people who were kind of more disaggregated before. So that's another cool thing that's coming from that. Lastly, short slide, crowd equity finance. This is, again, kind of helping people skip over, IPOs or more traditional financing strategies, either with accredited or non-accredited investors, and enabling people to invest directly in the technologies or companies that they think are or real assets, in investing in the real things that they think are helping us solve and deal with climate change. So that's another application that we have. And then last slide is just kind of the common themes about what all of this actually comes down to. Transparency, which is like not finance's biggest strong point. Decentralization is also really important. Accountability, operational efficiency and lower costs, and then big data and what that means for improving how we invest and what we're investing in, and if we're investing in upholds with our values. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren. I think what you did is you dotted a lot of the lines from the technologies to what it means for finance, and I think that's showing how considerable and significant the prospects are for all of these technologies. Some may win more than others in terms of their overall utility, but certainly useful. I note that a lot of you in the audience are taking photos of the slides, and that is great. Continue to do so. However, we've uploaded these up onto the UN website, all the slides, and there's also some new platform that I'm really not familiar with that it's also up on, Pokey something or another. So feel free to access those and relax if you want, or continue taking photos. We're going to have just a few minutes right now for questions and answers, and so ask away. Yes, the gentleman in the back there.
Currencies. Thank you. Dr. Brian von Herzen from the Climate Foundation. When it comes to cryptocurrencies, there are some interesting first examples and maybe some best practices. I wanted to ask about SolarCoin because I spent some time analyzing it, and it seemed like, yeah, frequent flyer air miles. I mean, do we really value those? Is that really where it's at? I mean, where's the crypto coin that's a ton of carbon? And how much progress are we making on that? I think this is directed to the person who's leaving.
You got busted.
I'm going to be so much sneakier about
That's
that.
awesome.
I really do actually have to run, so I think I'm going to pass it off to you. But I'm more than happy
yeah.
to Karl has all my contact. I'm more than happy to follow up on this. Anybody,
Make that flight.
So if I
Air miles.
repeat the question to make sure I have that correctly, is there a carbon equivalent for the solar coin? Was that the question?
I think Lauren had Venn up on the screen. So do you know Venn? So Venn is actually a digital currency. It's not blockchain. It's developed by a guy named Stan Stalnecker. He's a pretty brilliant guy. He's actually a contributor to Xpansiv as well. But Venn is backed by commodities and currencies, so it's a really stable digital currency. It's not one of the things that you see in the ICOs. It's actually incredibly stable. If you map it against the U.S. dollar, it's been stable over time. But one of the commodities that it holds is carbon. Actually, as a so every Venn that's used actually has a subset that's carbon. So when you use Venn, you're actually consuming carbon in a very real way. They actually buy carbon and take it off the market. So I think when you talk about hard currencies and things like that, that to me is in a lot of ways more solid than some of the other approaches to currency. So I don't want to say that the other, I think there's some great finance mechanisms, but when you really talk in how currency works, that's a backed currency with something, and it's backed with carbon, partially.
Okay, other questions in the middle there? Or no? No? Got it.
Hi, David Antonioli from the VCS. Thank you very much for the presentation. A question that was prompted by Lauren, I believe, but maybe one of you guys can answer. So one of the concerns that we had in the early days of the voluntary carbon market was the sale of carbon credits or carbon credit likes to elderly people who put in their pensions and got taken to the cleaners. Is there any kind of safeguards that blockchain or some of these new technologies we could use to actually prevent that and safeguard, folks being taken to the cleaners by folks trying to sell them stuff that isn't really for real?
You mean with regards to cryptocurrencies?
Yes, or some of the crowdfunding stuff that Lauren was mentioning as well.
Yeah, I think it's buyer beware right now. It's pretty crazy. I don't know how. I mean, people are. It's. I live in San Francisco. It's madness, like what's happening. So I think that's probably going to happen. And I don't know the protection mechanism other than people being smart. At this point, I think one of the ways, like we were talking about, where you have something like Venn that's actually backed by real things, is a way of doing it.
Hi, I'm Joelle Moses. I'm from BC Council for International Cooperation. So these technologies, I don't know too much about them, but it seems like there's a lot of obvious advantages of them. But I'm assuming that to access, even information about them or to work with these technologies, you need to have computers and internet, which is obviously not available to most people in the world, and particularly the most vulnerable people. So I'm wondering how these technologies can really help them. Thanks.
So we did some work for World Bank on this, and one of the things is the proliferation of mobility, so mobile technology. And so you're now being able to use digital currencies at a local level. So if we look at some of the leapfrog in some of the developing countries where you are moving all the way to directly to a mobile society from a communication standpoint, you can do currency transfer soon over SMS and all kinds of things like that. So I don't think it's fully perfected now and proficient, but it's not that far away.
And the UN has several agencies that are experimenting with blockchain to be able to transfer development finance directly to people on the basis that Joe just said. So if you want additional information, it's easy to Google, it'll pop up, or I can send you some.
We have time for one more question. I saw him.
Okay, and my name is Ingo Pur, and I want to answer this question about SolarCoin. I'm very close to the SolarCoin Foundation, though I feel I need to say something about it. What is SolarCoin? It's a proof of concept kind of effort, so it was never meant to, But what is it doing, right? And this is, I want to touch here on a fundamental property of blockchain. It's issuing an award in form of a solar coin for a producer of a megawatt hour of solar electricity, and the claim has to be verified. There's a procedure. So what is it doing? It creates a database of solar generation from producers around the world. So the first thing it does, it is improving completely in a big data kind of way the availability, this is what you are doing also, of real on-the-ground measured solar radiation, right? That can be, for example, used to calibrate other kind of like solar maps in terms of radiation, helping you to identify the potential, right? So it's kind of like awarding people for reporting data that is valuable and available then for the whole community, right? It does so by a financial reward. The currency idea is also there. The inventor of SolarCoin, Nick Gogarty, is also the author of the book of The Nature of Value and its analysis of what is money. And he realized, like money is a social contract which connects people who share values ultimately, right? And he said, there's a community of people out there who want to promote solar and who are willing to accept SolarCoin as a means of payment. I have solar coins. I've used it to pay coffee. I've used it to pay a parking ticket in New York, to support the initiative. It's a bit the way the transaction works, a bit around the corner, right? But what I'm also, this was a pilot, and the idea of expanding SolarCoin to something that's backed by carbon was kind of like an idea. And so we are kind of like in the process of exactly doing that, like a system, but first learning from the experience. And if you look at I recommend to everyone, look at the value evolution of solar coins, the idea that a community that gets larger, that creates a shared reward system, the value of that currency that this community is using will increase with the size of the community. And this is completely reflected in the SolarCoin price. So this whole economics around that, I think looks fantastic. And I think we have the data now to justify moving forward on that concept. Thank you.
Do you have anything to comment on that, or?
No, I think that idea of, so that's exactly where we started, Ingo, is the idea that you actually have to embed the value of natural capital in the things that transact. And so commodities look sort of like a currency in some ways, and we were like, they're transacting in mass without any information about either environmental or social value. So, but clear demand in the marketplace to try and get at that. So I think that coming at that and the nature of value is the core of what needs to happen. Like our systems need to reflect that.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all, and thanks for these excellent questions. I think if the traffic wardens are in on this, it really is telling. I don't know if that's good or bad, but if you can pay your parking ticket, that's indicative of something. So now we're going to move on from the technologies to an application that's near and dear to many of us, and I'm referring to the launch of the Vulnerability Reduction Standard Framework. So if we could have the slide series, what is it, 4 or 5? The next one. So, and where's the clicker? Did Lauren, oh, here we go. So, first of all, let me just tell you a little bit about who we are and what we are. What we are is we're working to help create a future where the best responses to climate change are, we hope, the choices that the world wants to make. That's ultimately what I think we all want to have, and that's why we're working here at the COP. But how are we going to accomplish this? This might be a little bit different from other approaches. And that's through creating standards and methodologies that are around target setting and creating a market mechanism for adaptation so that we can organize a large-scale market of what we call vulnerability reduction credits. Why? Why should we have a credit? I think the issue that concerned me most was finance. And although there is considerable resource spent on mitigation, not enough, there's considerably less that goes to adaptation. And the gap in terms of what is available versus what is needed to suitably make the world more resilient, considering that climate change is going to happen, is considerable. How are we going to fill this gap? Well, there is a dilemma here. The benefits of adaptation, as I show on a study done for Southeast Asia, shows considerable benefits compared to costs for doing good adaptation. But there's inadequate funding, and there are more immediate priorities. If you look at how much money was spent in disaster response in the Southeast US and the Caribbean compared to how much adaptation is spent there, I think you can tell where the priorities are lying currently, and I think that that's a bit sad. There's also no clear role for the private sector in scalable solutions. So private sector is involved, but there's not a clear way for them to find a reason to be involved in adaptation all too often. There's really a difficult way to compare actions across, are funds going for the maximum benefit? And there's no agreed upon approach towards baseline setting, monitoring, and verification. And all too often, what you see is a development model where a development agency or other party or government provides funds up front, monitors a project for a couple of years, and 20 years later, they're not going to be anywhere there. There's going to be no way of knowing if their project had impact directly. So that's why we're in this game, is to try to unlock that dilemma. But why are we doing this in a next generation governance panel right now? Why are we talking about this? Because there's no integrated governance system that can really create these incentives for adaptation. There's no way that it can, that climate scenarios can be understood in a way for setting baselines, for developing and designing projects. The Earth observation data isn't necessarily, there's perhaps no great incentive for people to really use robust data that's available. And the metrics for contract setting and other things just don't really exist right now. There's no pricing regime. There's no price signal put on climate adaptation. So what you have is either external transfers of money, aid to recipient, or you have endogenous funding if, for instance, a company wants to make itself resilient and has resources, it can do it. But for the most vulnerable, that's usually not an option. There's no general standardized approach to safeguard transparency, efficiency, monitor across systems. It just isn't out there. Well, until now. Our response is what we call the Climate Vulnerability Reduction Credit. I can't go into the details, but I've referenced here, we have monthly tutorials online, so you can get more details here. But basically, all I'm going to tell you about it is it's a measure of the outputs linked to real outcomes of climate adaptation projects, a single measure. It crosses sectors and project types. It's issued after you've done some work adapting, not at the beginning. And it can be used with other evaluation tools, so it doesn't have to be standalone. And the certificates that come are transferable, and you can put a price on them. And I think this is where we get to the finance issue here. This is the basic high-level equation, very simple. And it's based on IPCC's fourth assessment report, idea that vulnerability incorporates exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And those three elements are tied in a way that we interpret that can be generalized. So what do these things do? I'm going to the finance side of things here. You can have a flood vulnerable community. What you can do, however, is you can develop a project. That project can earn VRCs. The VRCs can be sold. And what this does is it can allow for a revenue stream that can justify third-party finance, private finance, public finance. It doesn't matter. It can be debt, it can be equity. But it creates this revenue stream, this price regime that allows for those benefits compared to the cost to be realized and accepted and turned into real capitalization of projects. So what we're trying to do is really address that adaptation dilemma. And we think what it does is it helps in terms of prioritizing investments. It's efficient because you look for the most cost-effective way to get the vulnerability reduction credits. It creates very strong, rigorous incentives for innovation because any party who has a good idea on ways to create VRCs can be involved in the game. It provides for sustained project action because you get the credits after you've proven through monitoring reports that are verified. You get the credits then, and so there's an incentive to keep the project resilient, keep the project going, keep the community safe, and it's pro-poor and pro-vulnerable. We have clear standards. We are very interested in making sure that we're seeking out, project developers are seeking out vulnerable communities because that's where they can do a lot to reduce the vulnerability of those communities. So what are some roles? You could probably already imagine a number of ways that VRCs could be used. We don't have time to go into all of these, but I'll just talk about a couple things. One thing is it could be useful for policy target setting. Look at how we use tons of CO2 equivalent for target setting for NDCs, for looking at how the global 1.5 or 2 degree target is set. Why don't we see if we can make target setting not just put a $100 billion figure and say, well, this is what we need to do, but focus on the vulnerability of communities and look at setting targets based on that. Another way that we could potentially use VRCs is if we create a governance regime around VRCs and different national pools and a central pool, you could create a global risk climate risk resilience hedging opportunity, because perhaps there's a bad year in Southeast Asia for climate impacts, and maybe it's not so bad in another part of the world, and so you can balance out a lot of the benefits, just like the IMF and central banks do for currencies. So, as I hit the clicker, this just outlines that very briefly, and it's just something we're mooting. Clearly, we need to have a discussion about this further and talk to a lot of different policymakers. So, we've launched our framework. What is this framework? We've worked on this for quite a number of years right now, and I'd just like to thank all of the people who have been involved in the drafting of it. Also, we've identified a lot of different and recruited a lot of different experts and gone through an 8-month process of expert review. It was all under non-disclosure agreements until just a month ago. Now it's released, it's on our website. And the process that we used to develop this standard looks at a lot of these new next generation approaches. We used Collaborate, which is a platform that Tom Bauman's company basically has, to create a very interactive environment for developing this, where we engaged, we were very transparent, all the comments and all the feedback are all publicly available. And the review process was iterative. That's why it took 8 months. But now we have something that we're proud to show the world, and now it's public and available. And so this is a little bit about what the standard framework includes. And it includes both methodologies and project document instructions. It talks about how these things can be monitored and verified. And it includes a new section on standards for indigenous communities consultation, which is important because they have a very different way oftentimes of looking at markets. So the templates are also there. Now, just because it's quantitative doesn't mean there's a lot of critical qualitative aspects. And this is embedded in these principles, including avoiding catastrophic harm. We don't want to do maladaptation. It includes being transparent, includes integrating the community into the decision-making process. And just to talk about the process to gain a VRC, it follows a very similar approach to voluntary and CDM-type markets, VCS, for instance. But we have a 10-year revision, baseline review, where based on 10 years of experience, based on 10 years of hopefully gaining adaptive capacity, the VRC project document has to be revised. So, with that, I'd like to now introduce Chiara Ambrosino. Thank you. Who's working with us right now on a project in Vietnam.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Karl. So I need to press the green button. Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk about a little bit from the perspective of an international NGO, so an implementing partner, how VRCs can be piloted, tested, and used on the ground on a real climate adaptation intervention. We're going to talk about a pilot in south-central Vietnam. Just first of all, the organization I work for and I represent is IDE. It's based in the States, and we work with rural farmers across the globe in Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast and South Asia, empowering women and men farmers through designing and developing business models that treat them as customers, as producers, as entrepreneurs. We do that through the power of markets, so we stimulate market systems. And of course, we work with a wide array of stakeholders, from governments, research institutions, local, national NGOs, foundations, donors, and so on. In the last, conscious about the impact of climate change on our communities, we have explicitly started looking at increasing climate resilience in our communities, so on the ground. The picture you see here is from a landslide in Nepal that hit one of our communities. So while ensuring we do good development on the ground, we are very careful in enabling the communities to thrive now and under future climate change. And we do so through a combination of different interventions that we co-design and co-develop with the communities, really looking at what is the context, what are the needs and the capacities of our communities. We work primarily in the agriculture and wash sectors. And you see here images from a number of different interventions. We work a lot in water resource management, of course. So there is an image on water micro-irrigation technology, so micro-sprinklers. There's an image top right of a rainwater harvesting system we have developed in Honduras. We work at the policy level, facilitating a local adaptation plan of actions in Nepal, for example, to the left. Of course, we promote the use of solar technologies, work on bioengineering to protect against floods, for example, and bottom right is a portable water filter that we have developed and we market in Cambodia. So those are just a few examples of what we've been doing. Of course, we implement a robust monitoring and evaluation system across our country programs projects. We look at a global level at 3 KPIs, and specifically at the impact of our initiatives in terms of increased income. We look at the scale, how many households we are reaching, and on the return of investment of our projects and interventions. We also have been assessing the efficacy of our intervention in terms of ability to increase the resilience of our communities. But we're very much interested in looking at global level and undertaking an evaluation of what and how our intervention are increasing climate adaptation, so mainstreaming that across our programs. And also, of course, we're interested in making sure that our intervention are self-sustaining and in the longer term. So that's the reason why we have been collaborating with the Higher Ground Foundation and have been piloted the use of VRCs on the ground, ex post, so in this case is at the end of one project in South Central Vietnam, in the Ninh Thuan province, where we had facilitated the development of markets for micro-irrigation technologies. So that specific project was particularly interesting and successful because what happened is that the region went through a very severe droughts between 2015 and 2016. And the evidence we collected showed that the households that adopted micro-irrigation technologies were able to respond much better during the drought. So what we know that, well, there's a number of benefits. So as I said, increased income. We also assessed water savings, as it may be clear through the use of micro-irrigation technologies. There's, however, a number of challenges that remain. Of course, skills and technology and supply chain of the technology at the local level, things that we tackle as organization. And the cost of adopting these sort of technologies, even though those are low cost. So the VRCs are actually aiming at tackling some of those challenging, specifically the finance part. So through the adoption of VRCs, the VRCs mechanisms, we can actually finance, ideally, our project in the longer term. So according to the standard framework that Karl just introduced, the VRCs are result from a cost-benefit analysis difference between the project being implemented and project not being implemented. What we could say about the pilot analysis, or preliminary outcomes of this pilot testing is that for the specific projects, we reached over 2,000 farms of an area around 210 hectares. We know the average income, so we can say something about the resulted VRCs generated over a longer period, a 20-year period of time. And the I'm not sure the. Oh. Sorry, I'm not sure about how the slide is showing now, if you can read the numbers and the text. Anyhow, so we could say that from the preliminary outcomes, over 5 million VRCs could have been generated in a 20 years period. Of course, assuming that the project maintains its activities as the VRCs are continuously monitored. What can I say? In terms of how the VRCs is promoted, there can be two different approaches, mechanisms that we kind of identified. One is the fund approach, where funds are created to stimulate incremental investments in a specific climate adaptation approach by putting a price on VRCs, or the funder approach, where funders are directly interested in purchasing VRCs to support adaptation enabled by ID, for example. Just to close up, I can say that VRC is, of course, a very appealing mechanisms for an organization working on the ground like us, dependent on grants, on financing. So what we intend to do is to pilot the mechanisms on other climate adaptation initiatives, integrate the use of climate information for both inform our project, but also to collect evidence of our initiative against specific climate threats. And of course, ideally, would like to mainstream the use of VRCs across all our interventions. So that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chiara. We're very proud to work with ID and have had a great working relationship and look forward to doing many VRC generating projects around the world. So thank you for talking about the real, on the ground, how this works. Yeah. And now, another part of what underlies VRCs is data. And this data is sometimes hard to get at. And if you can get it, it's hard to interpret it and use it, especially if you're a project developer. So that's why we've developed a relationship with the Group on Earth Observations based in Switzerland to try to make this data available and usable. And so we're very proud and pleased to have Doug Kripe from GEO talk about his platform, his way of looking at managing, organizing Earth observational data, and what it means in terms of VRCs. So thank you, Doug.
Well, thanks, Karl. As you can see on this slide, there are two acronyms. There's GEO, which he just explained is the Group on Earth Observations, and the other one is GEOS, which is the Global Earth Observation System of Systems. So if you don't remember anything else from my talk, hopefully you'll remember those two acronyms. So what is GEO? I'm not sure if you've heard of GEO. There are many, GEO is a prefix that gets thrown around a bit, but this particular GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, came into existence in 2005 as the result of the World Summit on Sustainable Development. So sustainability is something that is a theme that comes back in GEO's operations. And the idea is that Earth observations, whether they be from satellites or in situ, or whether they come from marine or aircraft or whatever the platform, the governments that came together after a couple of Earth observation summits decided that they wanted to put this platform together to open up and coordinate Earth observations globally. So the Group on Earth Observations, the best way to think about it, is an intergovernmental partnership or organization that's working to improve the availability and access of Earth observations for the benefit of society. And as I mentioned, one of the main ways in which we are working to open up access to data is through this Global Earth Observation System of Systems, GEOS, and I'll have a bit more to say about that in just a moment. But the point here is that GEO is really about two things. Number one, coordinating at a global scale Earth observations with each mandate, each national mandate, of course, being respected. There's nothing compulsory about GEO. It's not a member of the UN, although we are hosted by the World Meteorological Organization. And so it's outside the UN system, it's non-binding, and yet it does provide a platform for coordinating strategies and also opening up access to data. So here we go. Data sharing is something that's a major theme of GEO. Maybe you are familiar with the Copernicus, the European Commission's satellite project. So they have adopted an open data sharing policy, largely thanks to the work of GEO. The United States in 2007 opened up access to all of the Landsat archives, and this graph just shows that prior to 2007, the USGS was getting approximately 53 requests per day for scenes. That's when you had to pay for them. Now that they came to this open policy where you can just go and download it for free, this has increased by 2 orders of magnitude. And you can see the estimate of millions, if not billions of dollars have gone back into the economy because of the industry that's been stimulated by this. So in actual fact, not having an open data policy can be detrimental to your development economically. GEO is very interested in climate change, especially the Paris Agreement. We are looking at how to provide Earth observations for monitoring the Paris Agreement, as well as the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Resilience, and so forth. I'm going to just move along here quickly. My time is slipping away. The GEOS portal is where you can go to discover and access Earth observations. And this is not a central repository of data. It is a huge catalog of metadata. And the way that this works is that we have a discovery and access broker that goes out to create interoperability with data providers. And those are both in the public sector as well as some in the private sector. You can see down below that the ESRI, for example, has opened up a large a number of its catalogs to the GEOS broker. And so what you do is that you go to the GEOS portal and you can find over 156 brokered catalogs, 5,000 different data providers, and 400 million different resources are available. These, earlier, I think in the first talk, there was the mention was made of standards. GEO takes the approach that we don't tell people what to do. We go out and figure out how to communicate with them. So these are all of the standards that are supported by the Discovery and Access Broker that's at the heart of our GEOS portal. If you're interested in providing data, there's a registration process that you can go through that I'll leave you to look at this in a little bit more detail, but I would like to move on and get to the heart of the connection here with the Higher Ground Foundation and the vulnerability reduction credits. One way that we demonstrate impact here is through providing access to data that might not necessarily be there for entities such as the Red Cross. The Red Cross has been able to access human settlement layers that are made available by the European Commission through GEOS to help with their reestablishment and displacement or helping to get displaced people's access to them and get them relief in times of crisis. What we're interested in here with the Higher Ground Foundation is to provide specific GEOS portals, so portals that are looking at the kinds of Earth observation data they need to support vulnerability reduction credit projects. The way that we're doing this is we're We're in contact with Higher Ground Foundation, our GCI expert, which is not me, it's my colleague Paula De Salva. They have been in contact, and we're looking at how we could provide specific information for the example we just heard about in South Central Vietnam, and also in coastal Bangladesh, where they're looking at climate-enhanced flooding and what we might be able to do about that. So, for example, the kinds of data that we are trying to package up and perhaps provide through a VRC-specific portal is shown here. It ranges from atmospheric information to other information about the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, and then also about socioeconomic data. All of these are provided to us by, again, this huge list of providers that are working with GEO, and we're looking at how we can narrow that down for specific targeted use by VRCs in their projects. So the last slide I have here is if you're interested in hearing more about the GEOS platform, both as a data provider or as a user, there's a meeting coming up, a workshop that's going to be held in Frascati at the European Space Agency in Italy on the 20th through 23rd of March in 2018. And I think that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Doug. And now we've seen Red Cross noted twice, yes, but this was in a very positive way where you were able to have considerable impact on their efficacy. Yeah. So, thank you very much for that. I'm going to round off the formal part of this, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers, by just talking about sort of the way forward and what this might mean for you. I don't know who. I know some of you. I'd like all of you, but you know, depending on whether you're on the policy side of things, on the side of representing vulnerable communities, are you a technology provider? Are you in the carbon markets? Are you a banker? There's all sorts of wonderful people you could be, and I don't know who you might be, but we would like to partner with you. And so let me talk a little bit about how we're going to move forward. As I said, our goal is to create a future where the best responses to climate change are the best choices that the world wants to actually make. And so we've created the VRCs. What do we want to do? We want to have a combination of organic and policy-driven development of the use of VRCs, application of VRCs, for all of those different uses that I articulated in my previous discussion. Like for these to be building blocks for development with climate, but drawing a clear distinction between the two at the same time that, of course, there should be development and climate should be mainstreamed and should be integrated. But we need to draw a distinction when it comes to finance there. That can also be something that is integrated into supply chains for corporate trade, for sourcing commodities, for looking at opportunities for understanding where communities are vulnerable and where they're not. And for articulating international targets and commitments. I think this is a critical thing here at the COP. And also becoming a currency. And this is where we're looking at some of these integrations with distributed ledger technologies and how we can perhaps do this better and leapfrog over all the mistakes that have occurred. There have been mistakes in all sorts of different environments, from the carbon markets to the integration of systems of exchange. We can hopefully learn from all of those. And so what we're doing is we're launching the pilot, implementation, and partnerships phase. And it's a period to get it right, because we know we don't have all the answers right now, but we want to learn from all of you and all of the different disruptive technologies, all the existing approaches that work, what doesn't work. And we want to be hands-on with all our partners, whether these be technologists, whether this be project developers or communities, or data and climate services providers, or econometricians, you name it, bankers. We want to be hands-on and be working with you. So we're not going to be a hands-off organization yet, because we need to learn. So we're going to be biased now. But what we're going to do is create early action credits during this process in a world where we're developing the institutional structures, where we're developing approaches to better reviewing and approval, and where we're going to understand the financial implications and the price discoveries around where we can be using VRCs and how they can be involved in climate finance. So we're going to be involved with a number of different pilot projects, such as the projects that we're working with Chiara on right now, so that we can engage with all these different parties who have to be involved, from the community, from the vulnerable person, that child, down to the banker sitting in New York or London. We need to be involved with everyone. And we're going to be developing a whole set of methodological and process tools that are going to be fit for purpose for a standard that we'll then launch after the phase is done with. And so we're also going to be looking at developing auditor accreditation requirements, a fee schedule. We're right now in the midst of public consultation. You're all invited to that. But then we're also going to be revising the standard framework at the end of the pilot phase. We've already developed project document and methodology templates, but we're going to be developing and enhancing those, working on verification and validation guidelines, developing positive lists to the extent possible so we don't get into additionality, counterfactual debates or things like this with every single little project, seeing where we can basically have positive lists that may not be possible for every project, but then also looking at positive lists where there aren't significant emissions implications so that we don't have to worry about, well, are we doing more harm or good because we're emitting so much? And then also what climate model and Earth observational data and other data can be approved and used for our project documentation. And so we have a work program of creating these methodologies, and then we're also looking at seeing how we can design national and international funds and mechanisms, private or public, that can help provide this. Take existing resources that go for climate adaptation and mobilizing them in a different, and we think for some purposes, better way. And then also providing training and capacity building. We currently, as I mentioned, and here's a reference to we have monthly web trainings on VRC basics, and we'll be doing some more topical ones on issues like, well, I haven't even mentioned the income equalization factor. But, you know, how is this interpreted, how is this used, and things like that. Avoided impact cost calculation approaches and looking at different ways that cost-benefit analysis can be applied or should not be applied. Also looking at creating an institutional framework for the Higher Ground Foundation, because at the end of this period, we want to basically be a hands-off organization that sets standards, approves methodologies, manages technical review, and issues credits. But as I said, we're right now in the midst of a public review, and if you go onto Collaborase or go onto our website, you can be a reviewer of and provide comments to this. We're going to have public review through the end of February, and we really want for everyone to be involved in that. We're not just trying to do it because you have to do it, because no, we want to get the best and most input as possible. I'm not going to dwell with all of these different ways that we can apply disruptive technologies, new platforms, and so on. But I just thought it would be useful to begin exploring, and we're going to be looking at ways that we can do it better. We're already applying Standards Point 2, effectively smart standards that Tom introduced. We're looking at ways that Earth observational data is going to be better used, employing the GEOS platform and other things like that, and we're going to want to further build on that. We're exploring opportunities for using big data analytics, which we haven't really discussed here, but could be quite useful for assessing avoided impact costs by just taking data and looking at how basically changes in climate impact changes in various outputs and impact costs, and applying these where it would be reasonable for methodology developments. Further, we're developing a set of what we call VRPMs, Vulnerability Reduction Project Managers. And these are tools that are currently on Excel, but we may go further than that later, that apply this. We're looking at Internet of Things, especially for the monitoring space. We think that it's very useful, but it could be for other purposes. And then also looking at distributed ledgers, blockchains for transactions, but also perhaps to look at the inputs to, I've had a brief discussion with Joe about the inputs to a lot of quantifying VRCs. How could it play a role there? So this is our direction of travel. We've done our standard, we have a concept, we've gone through a public review, we're going through public review right now. We're going into this PIP phase where we're doing pilot projects but also building up capacity institutionally. In the future, we want to be a functional standards body. That's our direction of travel. But we want you to be traveling with us in that. So with that, I'd like to just open this up for a little bit of a discussion and question and answer. We have a little time. Questions? Yes, in the middle there. Behind, yeah.
Hi, my name is Chad. I'm with the UNFCCC here in Bonn. So quick question to Karl on the VRC. You addressed this a little bit, but if I may, it's a two-parts question. So the first part, you talked a little bit about policy target setting. In the state, we have renewable energy credit and the credit used there as well. But it really takes off when it's tied with policies. Right now, over 40 plus states has renewable energy standard. They set aside a solar credit to also set percentage. So with VRC, I wonder whether there's any effort to encourage champion cities or communities to set a target. So time-bound target saying by certain dates, they're gonna have this much credit generated. But if I made the other component of that, one of the projects being presented mentioned 50 million credit being generated by 2020 if activities hold. So in the renewable energy context, many states, especially California, has set aside certain percentage of the renewable energy credit generated, especially the revenue generated from that, going to the vulnerable communities. So if the 50 million credit being generated or whatever the number might be, is there any strategic planning or mechanism that you have to ensure that the benefit really goes to the vulnerable communities, who need it most, yet often have the least means to get it? Thanks.
Thank you. Those are two very good questions. I can't address them completely, but I will begin. In terms of policy target setting, I think you've cottoned on that it can be at all different levels. It can be at the level of a corporate who's setting targets for supply chain management or managing market risks, perhaps tied to a geographic region. It could be a city that's setting budgetary and other targets that are associated with a lot of the assets and the responsibilities that they have for their community. It can be set at the international and the national level. And we have engaged at those different levels to try to communicate the opportunities that exist. And we are getting traction there. I can say that we're engaging right now with Party on developing NDC/NAP target setting approach and entering into an MOU that isn't yet finalized, but we're working on to try to develop a target setting approach there. So we're making progress there. But since we've just launched, we definitely are open to all of your views, and I think especially at the level of the UNFCCC. I've had some good discussions already with your colleagues, but we want to continue to further develop this and so that we can transition, but also try to get the debate at the various meetings that you convene to be more usefully engaged around talking about target setting in a way that we think it would be more useful. So I hope that just begins to touch upon what we're trying. And I agree that at all those different levels, we want to have target setting be an impetus for that then sets a price, potentially, that then gets these projects financed and gets the private sector involved. For the second question, I think let me see how I can tackle this. So different projects generate different amounts of credits, but they all have to follow our principles and a number of standards that we have. And I showed you principles that included community consultation, included do no catastrophic harm. We're not going to promise do no harm because we can't guarantee that. And then the other issue is, and now I'm getting a little bit too technical, I tend to do that, but we know that there will be mistakes made, and we know that we're never going to get it 100% right. So we have confidence standards, but we don't say that it has to be 100% perfect, okay? Having said that, we don't want for a flood defense program to result in a catastrophic flood. And if you think of New Orleans, that's a situation like that. The community needs to be engaged at all levels. And that's also why different types of communities have to be involved, including the indigenous. And so these are very, very clear guidelines within our standard framework. But I think the critical aspect is to recognize that Higher Ground Foundation is not imposing an agenda of someone else on communities, but it's something that is community-led wherever possible, certainly oriented towards reducing the vulnerability of the communities in all cases because of the inherent nature of what the metric is. So I hope that begins to touch upon what we're aiming for and how communities are so critical, or the basis for our work. Yes, in the middle again. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Crystal Chow, and I'm a freelance journalist from Hong Kong. And my question is, given the fact that capacity is a huge issue when we talk about policy measures that are already in place and being implemented in a lot of countries, how would you go about your work without adding to some sort of compliance fatigue on the ground?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know if Chiara, if you'd have any perspectives on this, but maybe just a quick reaction. Yeah, I mean, there's considerable amount of work that needs to be done in a project document. But USAID has, for project costs, 5% of project costs are supposed to go to monitoring and evaluation. Reports, massive reports, are developed by experts and consultants, and I mean, it's already a considerable thing. What we hope to do is actually reduce compliance costs to the extent possible through the standard framework, through standard methodologies, so that the costs of compliance and the difficulty and the arbitrarily, the vagueness of what's measured isn't there, but rather it's regularized and systematized. So that's, I think, the main thing. Of course, there will be costs, but there has to be effective, robust standards and monitoring and verification. I don't know, Chiara, if you have any views?
I can add on ID sides and the way we work when we implement projects and we have to monitor and report against them. So we have a rigorous monitoring evaluation system. We have a department, a global department that oversees and provides capacity building to all our country programs and every single individual project. So depending on the requirements set by the donors, we monitor and track the different type of metrics aside from the global KPIs that I mentioned, the 3 KPIs that I mentioned. I can also say that we have a cloud-based monitoring information system that we implemented globally, linking Salesforce and TerraWorks, that basically links all the different segments of the overall system. So we are able to track progresses of our project real time from our headquarters, for example. So we already have a very rigorous system, but I do understand that VRCs would include additional requirements, but we're comfortable with that.
Yeah.
So Ingo Pool again. First of all, big congratulations. And I think to have something on adaptation is great. A comment, right? I've looked at this myself. The solution that you've come up with, basically to pick a unit price and then basically calculate the number of units, right, is nice. But fixing a unit cost creates a very little economic incentive, right? Because if there is no perspective of increasing value for the units I'm holding, right, there's a problem, which is why I think I look at this not so much as a currency proposition. I look at this as an insurance product, right, where you could structure it somewhat differently and create a payout, right, if in fact the measure that reduce impact costs actually proves to have worked, right? So I bet on this project being successful and there's a bounty for this, right? And if I'm wrong, if the project doesn't work, I'm losing my money. So it's an insurance product. And would be very interested, I know initiatives that are going on by actually the reinsurance people, right, who would be very interested in this, right? So that's and I think on the financing side, I actually think it could be as simple as going with what are the cost of implementing the measure and doing that in a cool way, right? And this is, again, a thing that I'm very fond of, and again, some marketing. There is a crypto token that's called Tree, and a tree is backed by a living mangrove in Myanmar. Myanmar, not a cool country these days. When we started the project, it was a cool country, right? And like coastal community protection, I mean, it's not only, it just happens to be there as a pilot, but it's actually a tree is, again, a crypto token that you can use to pay. It's popular in the kite surfing community because they care about coastlines. And it's, like happily circulating in that context, yeah.
No, I mean, thank you. We should have a discussion. I mean, we've talked a lot about insurance and how it can play a role, and it can. I think there's a whole variety of different ways we can take it, and it depends on you guys to take the standard, take the metric, and use it in different ways that we may not have even imagined. So thank you. Yes, if you could.
Brian von Herzen from Climate Foundation. So I'd like to understand the avoided impact cost in a little more detail. In particular, for the most vulnerable communities, wealth is oftentimes not measured in dollars. Oftentimes it's environmental wealth. And so I would ask questions of some examples of avoided impact costs when it comes to the most vulnerable communities that might have lost their fishing resource, they might have lost their coral reef, they might have lost their forest. This is how do you put a dollar sign on that? Yeah. And, it's as hard as putting a dollar sign on the Great Barrier Reef, I suppose.
Yeah, Priceless. That's a very good book I once read. I didn't agree with all the premises, but to what extent can you use cost-benefit analysis, and when may you be overreaching? I think is a valid question that I think a lot of us have thought long and hard about. I think, first of all, though, I am a proponent of that approach, viewed broadly speaking. However, if you look at all of the different, and I'm not an economist who focuses on cost-benefit analysis, but I've worked with these plenty. And if you look at hedonic pricing approaches, if you look at ways that non-market economies or subsistence people that, I've worked in Bhutan where you can assess in subsistence farming communities, just look at the market price, even if there may not be a lot of exchange going on between the community and a market, but you can look at the market prices at the local town, and then you can build up from there. And that does reflect, imperfectly, but it does reflect value. If you look at the time that it takes for a girl to travel 2 kilometers to fetch clean water because there's no local available source owing to climate changes, you can put a time value to her and go there. If you look at indigenous communities that don't really work necessarily in much of a market approach, don't have a lot of the same sort of Western cultural or colonized norms or whatever you want to say, who subsist and take value from nature, we are particularly fascinated and working to try to do a pilot project with an indigenous community. And as I said, we had a working group around indigenous, led by indigenous experts. And so we want to test and see how far we can go there and what needs to be done differently in those communities. And so we set it aside for that reason. So we do take these issues very seriously. But the fact is, what do we want to do? We want to have reasonable people sitting around a table be able to come to an agreement about whether it's a purchase of VRCs, whether it's a finance agreement, whether it's an agreement to do something to make the community resilient. And we're not going to get it right. But just like carbon dioxide as a metric is frankly not perfect either, it's good enough for people sitting around the table to start talking. And that's where we're going. And that's what we want. Sorry for the lengthy response, but it's very interesting. I don't know, do the panelists have any questions or issues in the last 2 minutes?
So I was just going to say, with the way I think Ingo's looking at it, it's all about demand. Right? So I like the idea of having a framework as a medium of exchange, and then it's a matter of identifying who cares about it. If it's a kite surfer or an insurance company, it's all about driving scalable demand. I think that's the critical role, is figuring out is there demand or where is the demand, and then designing for that outcome. I think having the underlying unit and the basis for doing that is fantastic, because you can't really, that's one of the biggest challenges. But then it's about making or translating that demand into a way of using the unit.
I mean, one thing, the community has demand. They may not be able to realize all the economic benefit, but sometimes they can. That's one thing that makes it actually, in ways, a little easier than mitigation sometimes, because you don't have this problem of the common where, if I don't do something, well, there's an vested interest by the people who benefit.
Right. I'm saying, like, but who's going to finance? Like, they have a demand to get that done. They want that outcome. Yeah. But who wants to finance that outcome for them?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, Doug, do you have any comments or?
Well, I was kind of, again, I was intrigued by what you said, that Earth observation data, there's no incentive to use what's available. So I'm kind of, I wonder if you can expand.
Yeah.
Did I catch you correctly?
There are insufficient and inappropriate incentives sometimes. Clearly people at ski resorts care about having good climate data for their investment planning and also for their seasonal decisions. So yeah, there are cases, just like vulnerable communities have demand for it. But the issue oftentimes is that it's the structuring of it to make the supply and the demand appropriate, but also it's a question over, we are trying to create demand for that data, because a lot of times if you look at what approaches or what is required for what's called adaptation projects, they're not demanding that Earth observational data be an input into the decision-making process as much as it really should be. And we do demand that. And that's why we create an incentive to use your data.
I mean, I think that's going back to our conversation about a year ago. That's why I'm very interested in what you're doing, because GEO is about the end user in actual fact. It's not, it's not what providers can provide, it's what do the end users need to make informed decisions. And so we're always looking for end users to hear what they need. Many times, the issues that we run across is end users don't know, A, that Earth observations exist, let alone B, how to use them, or they're in a developing area where they don't have access, they don't have the infrastructure. So that just, when you said that, that really rang a bell with me, and I'm interested to, to carry forth and see how we can supply your demand.
Well, thank you.
So just one comment on that. It's kind of what I was saying about the data is the new oil, right? So really, you're using this framework to actually refine your data and make sense of it.
Okay. Yes, Tom.
Well, if there is more time for questions, I don't know if
we
you're
were
allowed.
told we had a little more time, and
I'd seen
but I think not much, right? Yeah.
Ingo, did you still want to ask your question? No? Okay.
Okay. We haven't had a question from that side of the. Yeah.
The two people here? Yes, so this is very new territory to me, and it's very, very fascinating, and I commend all of you on the amazing work, and I've really been, my brain is a little bit full from this last week of lots of different types of data. I am trying to identify, we're looking at potentially doing a climate smart finance aggregator to try and help drive decisions towards resiliency, and trying to figure out where all these different things fit into quantifying and assigning resiliency values or vulnerabilities to investment, budgeting decisions, things like that as well, for developments and things like that. Can you help me, since this is not my area of expertise and I'm trying to see how it all fits, can you help maybe guide me through how this fits to that assignment? Does that make sense?
Okay, so your job is to
assign a resiliency or vulnerability value to any dollar spent on an investment, budget allocation, anything like that. And we're developing that concept right now and trying to figure out how to gather all the different types of data that are available to assist.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we'd be very happy to. I mean, basically, that's what we are, is a measure of outputs that are strongly correlated with expected outcomes. We can't go outcome. That's a bridge too far. But we can say that these outputs, meaning the expected avoided impact costs based on a consideration of a baseline scenario against a scenario where you develop an adaptation project, and where the baseline is a changing climate, and then we could avoid impact costs, and then if you take and compare, in fact, I've already done this for a few real projects, and then you just take and look at how many dollars per VRC is that project versus that project versus that versus that. And the interesting finding I found so far, which is interesting in more ways than one in terms of prioritization, is that you can have almost, in my experience, 2 orders of magnitude difference in the dollars per VRC delivered by different project types, which is telling about maybe how things are prioritized now. So, well, with that, I am so grateful. It is Friday, 3 p.m. We've gone late, but we were allowed to, which I'm, again, very grateful. It's Friday. You've had 2 weeks, if you were one of the hardcore, I was not, of being here at the COP, which is absolutely exhausting, stimulating. Your brain is full, right? Okay. And for you to stay, I am grateful for that. And I'm so grateful also for all of my partners and fellow panelists here for the excellent ways that we were able to integrate all of our different perspectives, worldviews, technologies, approaches, and projects into something that I hope was useful for everyone and will result in some actions towards making the world more resilient and making us drive towards a world where people will do what's best for the world because they want to. So thank you very much. Happy trips back, and until the next time.